to the first week of term 2 of the Warwick Society. Hopefully it should be a very good term. For those of us who aren't aware, we run weekly events. We have a couple of term cards here, so if you're interested in coming back, please feel free to grab one, and there's on Facebook. To start off, we have talks from our president, Callum Douglas, talking about capitalism and the environment, and we as a society, we are affiliated with Social Steel, and they produce these very nice newspapers that we have for sale. If you are interested in learning more about our organisation, feel free to pick up a copy. We just released the 300th edition, so I'm sure there's some very good stuff in there. They're just a pound, so feel free to speak to myself, Callum. Without further ado, we'll get started.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Well, I think that these images really well encapsulate really the state of the environment under capitalism, or at least the processes that are going on. See, massive problems of dealing with waste, and the massive amounts of waste produced, by the capitalist mode of production, which tends to just be dumped in a lot of third world countries and things. I believe this is a picture of waste dumped in Nigeria. In the bottom left, we see industrial ash and things piling up in Haiti, I believe. Obviously, massive deforestation and some things. I believe this is a forest being cut down in Kenya, and the tip of the iceberg really of being the problems of global warming that we're seeing, which obviously create almost an existential threat to human life as we know it. So in order to understand what's going on with the environment and how it relates to capitalism, we really have to understand exactly what the environment is, in a more fundamental way, and how we as human beings interact with it. So if we understand the environment as being everything that consisting of everything that is exterior to the body, so things, the air that we breathe, the food that we eat, all such things that we're constantly absorbing, into us and then releasing from us in this kind of dialectical process. And the environment around us is itself in a state of constant change, even without us, as we know. And this is, as the result of many interacting forces, because as Marxists understand, nothing exists in isolation within the universe. There's always forces that interact with one another, and this can be seen, at every level. This can be seen at, say, the astronomical level with the life cycle of stars as elements, come together. Helium and hydrogen react, creating more elements and things, creating massive energy that obviously fuels all of life as we know it. We see this, on a more geographical kind of level, geological level, with the movement of tectonic plates and things under the Earth's crust as a result of convection currents and things, which brings about massive changes in the climate and the environment that we see in. We see this on a biological level, with the way in which plants and animals and things adapt to the climate that exists and to one another. So yeah, and we see that basically the environment then is ultimately the source of everything that's needed for us to live. What we might call use values, something that is utterly essential to being able to survive. And living creatures other than ourselves are also, as I say, in constant interaction with the environment through the way in which they consume resources and things. The plants that they eat, the water that they drink, the air that they breathe. But they tend to do this instinctively. So that they can have a massive, effect on the environment. If you think of something like a beaver, for example, building the massive dams and things that they do across rivers, that they do, of course, instinctively, and which can have massive effects on the local ecology of an area. So it can turn an area into a wetlands or something that will allow lots of different new plants and flowers and things to grow. Will attract bird life and fish and all sorts of things. Like we see that animals themselves have a massive impact on the environment. So what is it, essentially, that differentiates the way in which we react to the environment to the way in which other animals react? And we can see ultimately that it's that it is the ability of humanity to labour, which is in turn also labour is what has allowed humans to transition from ape to man, as Engels' his text, The Part Played by Labour in the Transition from Ape to Man, describes the way in which being able to stand upright and use our hands for all sorts of different activities was central to the growth and development of our brains and things, as we were able to take on more tasks and challenges. So our social communication and things evolved as a result of this. And so yeah, what we have as humans is a capability to actively transform and shape the environment in order to meet our needs, whilst other animals can only take from the environment what is just at hand. So take fruit from the trees. We're able to cultivate the land and take from it more than is readily available. And then, so the way in which this labour is played out is then completely dependent on the social organisation of that labour. So we know that society's gone through different phases, different forms of and modes of production, and the way in which labour is organised within a society massively impacts the way in which we relate to the environment at different times. And I'll come on to the specifics of capitalist relation to the environment. And these actions at any point in history that are driven by social requirements will always bring us into some form of conflict and contradiction with the environment. Obviously, we see the massive one today is climate change, but think perhaps of the people of Mesopotamia and Greece and ancient Greece, whose cultivation of the land, led which was incredibly fertile land over time, led to soil degradation and things, and completely ruined the agriculture of these regions, which now are incredibly poor in terms of their agricultural qualities. So what specifically can we see from the capitalist mode of production? How does it work? So we see that capital is necessary for any form of production under capitalism. It works in what Marx calls like a circuit of capital, in which capital is initially invested in order to purchase the means of production. So that's the factories, machinery and things, what we might call constant capital, because it's fixed in place once it's been bought, and labour power, what they buy through paying a wage to a wage labourer to pay for a few hours of their time in a day, in order to create value, to use all of the machinery and implements to create commodities that can then be sold on the market. We then see that these commodities have to be exchanged on the market a higher price than the initial investment in order to create a profit. The need for a profit is forced by the competition that exists within the system, because to not create a profit, to not grow and develop as a company, means to go bankrupt, to go under, and for all of the money to be wasted in it. And so, yeah, this profit must be reinvested. But the profit itself relies on being able to exchange these goods at a higher price than they cost to produce. And this means that the exchange is predominantly happening with exploited labourers who are only paid a wage that is a fraction of the input cost into the production of a commodity. So there's always a trend towards the purchasing power of working people decreasing over time to a point at which they no longer have the wealth to be able to buy back all of the commodities and things that are produced by the capitalists. This is what we call a crisis of overproduction. And capitalism is forced in these kind of situations to find ways of retaining profitability. So there's lots of ways in which this can be done, but it's only temporary in any of these cases. It does not solve the underlying contradictions that exist within the system. So we see all sorts of things like the availability of credit or something, allowing consumers to take on massive debt that they can then use to purchase products. This is, of course, what happened throughout the 1980s and 90s, and then ended with it didn't end, it's still ongoing today, but came to a head with the 2008 financial crisis, which obviously revealed that this had its limitations. And we see it through automation, by being able to produce machinery that can produce commodities at a much faster rate, so you can lay off workers and decrease the price of the commodities so that they're affordable again to the consumer. And one of the most important way perhaps that we see it is through imperialism. So imperialism is something that occurs in the monopoly stage of capitalism. So this is when capital tends to be massively concentrated within particularly financial institutions and such that have the ability to move capital incredibly rapidly to areas of the market that are profitable to them. And this includes to move it to areas where there are cheaper sources of labour, cheaper raw materials and things, in order to drive down the price of commodities to make production profitable again. And this was the cause for what we saw the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, when the imperialist powers of Europe sought to divide the African continent among them. And it was divided in a way in which those countries that had significant quantities of financial capital, particularly France and Britain, were the ones that were mostly taking over colonies and things in those areas. And it's of course apparent today. It's apparent in the actions of the imperialist powers of the US. For example, their wars of foreign intervention and things, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now in Syria. And it's even apparent from the actions of China in recent years. They have this thing called the One Belt One Road initiative, where they've spent massive amounts of money on projects in other countries to try and reinstate basically the Great Silk Road of ancient times. And what they do is they give like loans and things to these countries in order to undertake these kind of projects, and they force them to use Chinese companies in order to carry them out. So it's a way of investing money essentially into these countries to allow for an expansion of demand for Chinese goods and services and things. So what is the importance of fossil fuels as a particular commodity and capitalism? Well, they've been basically the basis for economic growth throughout the 20th and 21st century. Crude oil creates an incredibly cheap and reliable form of energy. One that unlike other forms of renewable can be burned at any time to produce energy. And it's used to generate electricity, to power cars, planes, and all sorts of machinery used in production. And as a byproduct almost, it also can be used in the production of plastics, which is why we've seen massive expansion in the use of plastics. And it's easily movable and can create energy in any conditions. And it's obviously facilitated what is one of the largest industries in the world, and has been for a long time, which the car industry, which has become, of course, incredibly deeply ingrained within Western culture. Thanks. And you see that as it's such a fundamental source of fuel for the capitalist economy, times in which there are high prices of oil, in particular, are very dangerous. So say in the early 1970s, there was the Yom Kippur War, where Middle Eastern countries drove up the price of oil that they were selling to the US, which led, I think, to a quadrupling of the price of oil in Britain. I think even tenfold in the US, which of course was not the cause of the economic crisis throughout the 1970s, but massively added to it, and was a major cause of inflation in particular at the time. And so control over oil as a resource has been a massive aspect of imperialism for decades, particularly US imperialism within the Middle East, and obviously is a major factor in US intervention in Iraq in particular. And we also see a problem of capitalism in the way in which waste and things are created and distributed. So at times when there's economic growth, it means an increase in the amount of goods and capital that people hold. But waste is also created in the process by which we produce. So we see things like pollutants being released into the air, carbon dioxide and other fossil fuels in particular, through the process of production. And we see that the way in which waste tends to be distributed, it tends to be distributed in a way that can cause the minimum effect on profitability. So you find ways of distributing waste that will affect the lives of people who are not necessarily seen as economically necessary to the capitalist economy. So particularly people in third world countries whose deaths don't really matter to the capitalist economy. And this is something that was attested to by Lawrence Summers, who was chief economist for the World Bank. In 1991, he wrote a memo where he argued for the need to address the toxicity imbalance in the world by allowing more and more polluting industries to move to the third world, so that they could affect the health and lives of people there instead of in rich capitalist countries. And the Economist leaked this memo, and they said about it that obviously its treatment of the poor in these countries is horrific, but the economics is difficult to argue with. So we see obviously these aspects of the capitalist economy. So you see the ecological impacts of this both on a local and indeed a worldwide level as capitalism has become global in its impact on the environment. So here's a more localized kind of example of its effect in the oil spills and things in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, or what's commonly described as the Delta of Death. So Nigeria as a country is massively dependent on oil as a commodity. It makes up 70% of government revenue. And the Niger Delta itself is one of the largest oil reservoirs, and it has many private companies and things like Shell, Chevron, Agib, and Elf that are all active in this area. And as a result of the necessity for oil to be sold to these companies at a cheap price to keep their business in this area that's so vital to the Nigerian economy, we see that there's incredibly limited environmental regulations and things. So waste and things tend to go completely untreated. And the impact of massive amounts of oil spills as a result of this has been that the land, air and water in this area have been essentially poisoned, making the subsistence of people who live off of the land in this area incredibly challenging. And they've caused significant health defects throughout the area, like increased risk of cancer, mercury poisoning, and food insecurity. And prenatal death rates have massively spiked in the area. So that's deaths of children before birth. And they've more than doubled in the area as a result of this. And of course, on a more worldwide scale, as capitalism has expanded into a global force, we see the most obvious issue of today within the environment of global warming. And I've just cherry-picked a list of just a few of the significant problems and crises that are impending as a result of global warming, and things that are already playing out today and will massively increase over the years to come. So problems like rising sea levels, which add to the problems of more powerful and frequent hurricanes. We saw, for example, last year in the US, that was 2 years ago now, it's a new year, Hurricane Irma, which was, of course, the largest hurricane on record. We've seen we've seen longer and more damaging wildfire seasons. We've seen in California, in Australia, massive wildfires, biggest on record in the last couple of years. You've seen increased heat waves and things, flooding in places like Bangladesh in particular, and droughts and things, all of which come with a substantial risk of undermining the capability of people in these areas to continue to subsist, to live, all of which bring massive economic risks and things to them. Yeah, we've seen in the last 30 years or so, I think a quadrupling of the number of these major weather events and such. So what are the solutions that are offered to us under capitalism? Well, one of the main ones is these international agreements, things such as the Paris Climate Agreement. There was also the Kyoto Accords, the Copenhagen Agreement, things we've had in the last 20 years, and none of them have really done anything to combat climate change. So the Paris Agreement a couple of years ago there was an agreement to keep global temperatures at a level that was within 2 degrees of pre-industrial levels. And this, of course, requires a massive cutback in our use of fossil fuels. It also requires, even for carbon that's already in the atmosphere, to be removed from the atmosphere. But instead, we see that fossil fuel consumption is actually still rising. And there's, of course, renewable energy has been put forward as the solution to this. But there's a problem with this, and that renewable energy actually creates a massive challenge to the energy market, as it has much lower running costs once it's in place. Once you have your wind turbines, your solar panels, and whatsoever in place, the running costs of renewable energy are almost negligible. And the result of this would be to massively undermine the profitability of fossil fuels. And to massively undermine the profitability of fossil fuels, first of all, means that fossil fuel companies have no interest in investing in renewables, because what it means is in a few years they're going to completely lose their profit margins. It also... No, sorry. I'll move on. I've forgotten what I was going to say on that. And we see today that energy actually is one of the most profitable areas of the market. So, of the fossil fuel energy, particularly as a result of fracking and things in the US. So there's really no interest for countries at the moment, no economic interest for countries to quit the practice of using fossil fuels. And we see actually that in the EU, which historically has been put forward as the bastion of change and challenge to the issue of climate change, only 3 countries are actually on track to meet the requirements of the Paris Climate Agreement: Sweden, Germany, and France. Of course, countries where a lot of what they consume is produced using fossil fuels and things, but in other countries they've kind of offset it to the third world. So of course their impact hasn't necessarily decreased at all over the last few decades, but they can put this forward, as an idea that they're being progressive in some way. We put forward again the idea of technology, the idea, as I've said the problems with renewable energy, which has resulted actually in investment in renewable energy falling massively in the UK by 56%, and we actually subsidise fossil fuel companies. In the US, we've seen tariffs and things being put on solar panels. As I said before, in order to meet the requirements of the Paris Agreement, there's a need, in fact, to actually extract carbon dioxide and things from the atmosphere. And this is something that actually we have the technology to do. We do have carbon extraction technology, but there are no market incentives to actually put it in place. It's incredibly expensive, and there's no way that you can actually sell the carbon. Like there have literally been competitions and things that have been run with massive, hundreds of thousands of pound prize money, saying, try and find us a way that carbon can be profitable, so that we can actually use this kind of technology and things. At the moment, there's no market incentives for it whatsoever. A frequently put forward perspective is the need for a carbon tax. So you impose a tax on either a business or an individual for the use of carbon. But under capitalism, obviously, as we know, businesses need to maintain their profits. So they tend to, so any costs like this are borne on consumers. So in places where, in places like British Columbia, where this has been put into place, all the businesses have done is just raise their prices, so all of this has been borne by working class people who have had to deal with higher prices and things. And so carbon taxes are essentially an attack on consumers and on workers, rather than actually a solution to solve the problems of climate change. And this has been shown by the Yellow Jacket movement in recent times, where there was an attempt to implement a petrol tax by the Macron government, using this kind of environmental rhetoric that we need to come together and save the environment, to cover for what were really blatant attacks on living standards on working people. And of course there's been a massive reaction as a result of this. And one of the other significant ways in which capitalism tries to make us deal with the problem is by taking personal responsibility for the problem, that it is a problem ultimately of individual consumption rather than a systemic problem of the drive for profit under capitalism. We have to recognise that the reason that we have massive consumerism within the West is that it is an invention of capitalism. It's not. There's nothing innate or natural about our greed and our need to consume lots of products. This is created through targeted advertisements and things. Monopoly capitalism makes it incredibly difficult for companies to expand by branching out into new markets and things, because these spaces in the market are taken up by other monopoly capitalist powers, companies and things as well. So the only way in which to increase their profitability is to try and increase the market that exists for their the goods that they have already, by convincing people that they need to buy these products and things. And this consumption is then massively reinforced through our culture, through television, through the media, all sorts of things that create a standard of living for people that they need to maintain by purchasing more and more products and things. So why do we need socialism as a solution to the problems? Well, ultimately, obviously, the contradictions of capitalism no longer apply. Capitalism creates this innate drive towards expansion, consuming more and more materials of the environment, because of its innate need to increase profitability. And this does not exist when production is under control is under workers' control, and is not predicated on capital investments. You have a situation where workers can decide how things are produced, how goods and waste and such is distributed. And this means that these decisions will be being taken by those who are affected by environmental degradation and things. And therefore, the decisions will likely be made to minimise the impact that we have on the planet. And goods and services will be produced in a way in which to meet social needs rather than market needs. So we wouldn't massively overproduce more than what is needed for society, just to sell to people things that we have to convince them that they need. We produce only enough to meet people's needs, rather than to meet the needs of profit. And we can see that technologies and things like carbon extraction and renewable energy there's a massive social need for these things in order to combat the environmental crisis that we see, but as they're not profitable, they're not undertaken. So what is the conclusion that we can draw from this? We have to understand that the damage that's being done to the environment is systemic, is rooted in the contradictions and limitations of the capitalist mode of production. And the only way in which we can prevent this ongoing ecological crisis is by fundamentally changing the way in which we produce, distribute and exchange commodities and goods. Things. So the environmental struggle as a result has to be linked to a class struggle, to a struggle within the working class to overthrow capitalism and replace it with a democratically run, workers-controlled system. Yeah. Okay, so that's it.